In the bitter first week of October, 1886, along the wind-scoured flats of the Powder River country in Montana Territory, while other homesteaders busied themselves with the familiar rituals of survival, chinking log walls with fresh mud, stacking firewood in high dry cords, and driving heavy plank shutters over their glass windows, Silas Thorne was doing something no one in the valley had ever seen before. He was hauling hides. Day after day, from before the sun crested the eastern ridges until long after it dropped behind the bighorns, Silas dragged rolled bundles of tanned skins across the frozen dirt yard toward his small squared log cabin. Buffalo robes thick as a man's palm, elk hides softened with brain tan until they draped like heavy wool, wolf pelts still smelling faintly of sage smoke, beaver, otter, and mink from his own trap lines. And beneath it all, layered like the pages of some strange leather book, the thin, flexible skins of pronghorned antelope he had traded for at Fort Keogh the previous spring. He was not stacking them for sale. He was nailing them to the walls, not on the outside where a passing traveler might mistake it for some crude form of shingling. On the inside. Layer over layer over layer from the floorboards to the roof beams, pressed tight and overlapped like the scales of a great sleeping fish. Buffalo first, closest to the logs, then elk, then wolf, then the lighter pelts near the innermost surface where his family would sleep, cook, and pass the coming winter. Inside that half-finished cabin were his wife, Eleanor, 7 months heavy with their third child, and their 2 young sons, Wyatt and Coleman, who carried the smaller hides in armloads while their father worked from a rough ladder with tacks between his teeth. Travelers on the freight road slowed their wagons to gawk. Some laughed openly. A cattle drover named Beaumont, riding through with a string of half-starved steers, called out that Silas Thorne must have gone touched in the head from too many winters alone before he married. A homesteader's wife, riding shotgun on her husband's buckboard, crossed herself when she saw the stacks of hides piled in the yard, muttering that no Christian household ought to look like the inside of a trapper's cache, because that was the strangest part of what Silas was doing. It looked to every set of eyes that saw it like a man building a den instead of a home, like something a mountain animal might construct if it learned to swing a hammer. There was no elegance to it, no craftsmanship, no neat rows of squared timber or fine plaster finish. Just hides, hundreds of them, going up in silence while winter breathed down the valley. What did Silas Thorne know that his neighbors did not? What had he seen, or heard, or been taught that convinced him to gamble his family's lives on a wall of dead animal skins instead of good honest lumber and stove-cured brick? And when the coldest winter in the recorded history of the American West finally arrived, hard enough to freeze cattle standing in their tracks and turn men to statues in their saddles, would those hides be his salvation or his shroud? Subscribe now to witness what happened when the sky itself turned to iron. One gray afternoon, while a thin, dry snow drifted in fits across the yard, a wagon pulled up along the frozen ruts of the trail. The man driving it was Josiah Barnes, a rancher who had held ground in the valley for nearly 18 years. He had buried 2 children and 1 wife to Montana winters already, and he wore the memory of it in the deep lines around his mouth. Josiah climbed down slowly, his joints stiff from cold, and stood in the middle of Silas's yard staring at the open cabin doorway where hide upon hide hung layered in the dim interior light. For a long moment, Josiah said nothing. He rubbed his gloved hands together and studied the strange leather walls the way a man might study a sick animal, trying to decide whether it could be saved. "Silas," he finally said, "a man builds his house of wood and stone, not skins. That's what savages do, and even they know enough to move their lodges when winter turns hard." Silas did not answer. He climbed down from the ladder, wiped tack dust from his fingers, and looked past Josiah toward the far northern horizon where a strange dark seam had begun forming along the edge of the sky. Josiah followed his gaze, but saw only the pale distance of afternoon prairie. Whatever Silas was looking at, whatever warning he read in that thin dark line above the bighorns, the older rancher could not see it yet. "You've got a woman inside carrying a child," Josiah said, his voice lower now, almost gentle. "You've got two boys who trust their father to keep them alive. This ain't the time for experiments, Silas. This ain't the time to try what nobody else has tried." Silas turned his head slowly. His face was weathered from years of trapping in the high country, and there was something in his eyes that Josiah did not entirely recognize. Not madness, not even stubbornness. Something quieter, something closer to remembrance. "I ain't experimenting, Josiah," Silas said. "I'm remembering." Josiah opened his mouth to ask what that was supposed to mean, but Silas had already turned back toward the ladder. The conversation, whatever it might have been, was finished. The rancher stood in the yard for another long moment, watching the strange, silent work continue, then climbed back onto his wagon and rattled away down the frozen trail without another word. That evening, after the boys had eaten their supper of salt pork and pan bread and curled beneath their blankets in the loft, Alina sat at the rough plank table with her hands folded around a tin cup of coffee grown cold. She watched her husband by the light of a single tallow candle as he sharpened tacks with the edge of a small file, his movements slow and deliberate. The child inside her shifted, pressing against her ribs, and she pressed her palm flat against the swell of her belly to steady it. "Silas," she said softly, "tell me why." He did not look up right away. The file whispered against iron. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, dragging a low, mournful note along the eaves. "When I was a boy," he finally said, "younger than Wyatt is now, my father took me north with him to trade at a Blackfoot winter camp along the Marias River. We got caught in a storm on the way back, 3 days of it, wind that peeled the bark off trees, cold so hard it split rocks in half." He set the file down. "We would have died out there, Alina, both of us, but we made it back to that camp. The Blackfoot took us in." Alina waited. She had heard fragments of this story before over the years, but never the whole of it. "Their lodges were skin," Silas said. "Buffalo hide, layered thick, drawn tight over the poles. Outside those lodges the wind was killing everything that breathed. Inside, a man could sit in his shirt sleeves beside the fire. I remember it because I could not understand it. My father could not understand it either. He had built log walls his whole life, and log walls were not warm the way those skin walls were warm." He looked up at her then, and the candle flame caught in his eyes. "I asked one of their old men how it worked. He told me wood remembers the forest. It remembers standing straight in the cold. It does not know how to hold heat inside itself the way a living thing does. But skin," he said, "skin remembers the animal. Skin remembers being warm. Layer it thick enough and it will remember for you too." Alina was quiet for a long time. The wind outside pressed against the walls of the cabin, testing them, feeling for weakness. "You believed him," she said finally. "It was not a question." "I did not believe him then," Silas answered. "I was too young, and my father laughed at it later around the fire, and I forgot for a long time. But I have seen 4 hard winters in this country now, Alina. I have watched neighbors freeze inside cabins built the proper way. Log walls, chinked tight, good stoves, good roofs. It was not enough. Something in the way the cold works out here, it finds the wood. It gets inside the wood and it stays there." He paused. "The Blackfoot were living in this country before any of us. They knew things we did not bother to learn." Alina turned her cup slowly between her palms. Somewhere out in the darkness, a coyote lifted its voice against the rising wind, and the sound trailed off into the empty distance. "How cold do you think it will be, Silas?" she asked. He did not answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice was very quiet. "Colder than any of us have ever known." The next morning broke gray and windless, which was in some ways more troubling than a storm would have been. Silas stepped out onto the frozen yard at first light and stood for a long while simply looking at the sky. It had that same flat quality he had noticed the day before, that thin dark seam along the northern horizon, but it had widened now. It looked less like a seam and more like the shadow of something enormous drawing closer. He set the boys to work before breakfast. Wyatt, 10 years old and already carrying his father's stubborn quiet, hauled bundled elk hides from the small shed behind the cabin. Coleman, only 6, followed his older brother in a stumbling shadow, dragging a single beaver pelt that was nearly as large as he was. Their breath came in white plumes that hung in the still air. Inside the cabin, Silas continued layering. He had a system now, worked out over weeks of careful thought. Against the raw logs themselves, he had already fastened the heaviest hides, buffalo robes trimmed square and overlapped so that no seam ran directly against another. That was the first lesson from that long-ago Blackfoot Lodge. No cold air could travel in a straight line if the seams never lined up. Every layer had to break the path of the last. Over the buffalo went elk. Over the elk went wolf and coyote, mixed together for density. Then the smaller pelts near the innermost surface, where the roughness would not press against a child's face in the night. Along the ceiling, he had done the same thing, tacking hides directly to the underside of the roof planks and leaving a small gap between the leather and the wood so that any warm air rising from below would be trapped there and held. Around the single window, he had rigged something even stranger. A double curtain of hide, drawn on wooden rings, so that during the coldest hours the glass itself could be sealed off behind two heavy leather panels with a pocket of dead air between them. During the day, when a bit of sunlight might warm the cabin, the curtains could be pulled aside. At night they would close. The door had received the most attention of all. Silas had built a second frame just inside the original doorway, spaced 18 inches away from it, and stretched hides across that frame as well. Between the two doors was a small enclosed space, hardly larger than a closet, where a person entering from outside would stop, close the outer door behind them, and only then open the inner one. He had seen it in the Blackfoot lodges. The old man had called it the breath room, a place where the cold air surrendered before it could reach the fire. By mid-morning, another visitor arrived. This one was different. Her name was Hattie Coyne, and she was the closest thing the valley had to a doctor. She had trained as a nurse in Chicago before her husband dragged her west, and after his death from a horse fall 3 years back she had remained in the country because she had nowhere else to go and because the settlers along the Powder needed her. She rode a small paint mare and carried her medicines in a leather satchel across the saddle horn. Hattie had come to check on a leaner whose time was drawing near. But when she stepped down from her horse and saw the interior of the Thorne cabin through the open door, she stopped where she stood. Her mouth actually opened slightly, though no sound came out. "Silas Thorne," she said finally, "what in the name of heaven have you done to your walls?" Silas came down from his ladder and greeted her properly, taking her satchel and helping her over the frozen threshold. Alina was already rising from her chair by the stove, one hand braced against her lower back. Hattie stepped inside the cabin and stopped again. This time it was not shock on her face. It was something else. She lifted one hand and touched the innermost layer of hide beside the doorframe, pressing her fingers into the soft fur. "It's warmer in here," she said slowly, "than it has any right to be. The stove is barely going. Silas, this room is warmer than my own cabin, and I've had a fire in my box stove since dawn." Silas said nothing. He only watched her, waiting. Hattie moved further into the room, her eyes traveling up the layered walls to the darkened, hide-lined ceiling. Then she looked at Alina. "Sit down, honey," she said. "I need to think a minute." Alina lowered herself carefully back into her chair by the stove, and Hattie Coyne took the seat opposite her, though her attention was not on her patient yet. Her eyes kept drifting to the walls, to the ceiling, to the strange double doorway with its enclosed pocket of still air. She was a practical woman, trained in the sciences of her time, and she did not believe in things she could not measure. But her hands and her face were both telling her the same thing, and neither of them was lying. "How thick are the layers, Silas?" she asked at last. "6 deep along the north wall," he answered. 5 along the east and west, 4 along the south where the sun hits." She nodded slowly as if working through a calculation. "And the ceiling? 3 with a gap of air between the hides and the roof planks. And that doorway, 2 doors, dead space between. Nobody comes through both at the same time." Hattie was silent for a long moment. Then she looked at Alina, and her professional demeanor returned all at once as though a door had closed somewhere inside her. "How are you feeling, honey? Any cramping, bleeding, trouble breathing?" Alina shook her head. Tired, my back aches most days. The child moves plenty, I'd say more than the boys did. Hattie examined her carefully, listening to her pulse, feeling the position of the baby with her practiced fingers, asking her the small, quiet questions that a woman in her condition needs to be asked. When she had finished, she washed her hands in the basin by the stove and stood for a while looking at the fire. "You've got another 3 or 4 weeks, I'd guess," she said finally. "Maybe less. Bobbies come when they want to come, not when a doctor tells them. But I'll say this, Alina. If it happens during a storm, you're going to be glad you're inside these walls instead of mine." Alina looked up sharply. It was the closest thing to praise she had heard anyone offer her husband since the work began. Hattie pulled her coat back on and gathered her satchel. At the doorway she paused and turned back to Silas, who had been quietly hanging another wolf pelt beside the window. "I don't understand what you've built here," she said. "I don't understand the how of it, but I've been inside enough cabins in this country to know what cold feels like through a wall, and I don't feel it through yours. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." She rode away with the paint mare picking its way carefully over the frozen ruts, and Silas stood in the yard watching until she disappeared around the bend of the trail. When he turned back toward the cabin, he saw that the dark seam on the northern horizon had grown wider still. It was no longer a seam. It was a band, and the band was moving south. That afternoon he doubled his pace. He sent Wyatt out to the woodshed to bring in every stick of split pine and stack it inside the cabin itself, in the small space between the double doors, where it would stay dry and be close to hand without requiring anyone to step outside during a storm. He had Coleman fill every water bucket they owned and set them by the stove, so they would not freeze solid overnight. He had Alina go through the food stores with him, item by item, so they both knew exactly what they had and where it was. Salt pork, cornmeal, a crock of pickled beets, dried apples, a small barrel of flour, beans in a canvas sack, coffee precious and rationed, a tin of lard, molasses, 2 smoked hams hanging from the rafters, jerked venison in strips, a wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth, enough if they were careful for 6 weeks, perhaps 2 months if they stretched it. Silas looked at the stores and did the arithmetic silently in his head. Then he went outside again and killed one of their 2 remaining hogs, dressing it out in the cold yard with the boys watching solemnly from the porch. By nightfall, the meat was hanging in the small smokehouse behind the cabin, and Silas was scrubbing his hands with lye soap at the basin. Alina watched him from the stove. "You think it will be that long, Silas?" He did not answer directly. He only dried his hands on a rough cloth and looked out through the small square of window toward the darkening northern sky. "I think we ought to be ready either way," he said. The first hard snow came the following night, though it was not yet the storm Silas had been watching for. It fell straight down in the still air, heavy and wet, piling in white cushions along the porch rails and softening the hard ruts of the yard into gentle curves. By morning, the world outside the cabin had been remade in silence. The boys pressed their faces to the window glass and marveled at it, their breath fogging the pane while Alina stirred cornmeal mush at the stove. Silas stepped out into the fresh snow at first light and walked a slow circle around the cabin. He was not admiring the beauty of it. He was reading it. He studied the way the snow had settled against the walls, looking for any place where the drift climbed higher than it ought to. He examined the small mound that had formed along the north side, and the thin bare patch that had appeared beside the chimney where rising heat had melted the flakes as they fell. He noted the direction of the small ridges the wind had left on the surface, and the angle they made against the walls of the cabin, and the shape of the drift where it curled around the woodshed. When he came back inside, he stamped the snow from his boots in the breath room between the 2 doors and closed the outer door carefully behind him before opening the inner one. Alina looked up from the stove. "Well, chimney's drawing clean," he said. "Snow's melting off the roof over the stove pipe. That's what I wanted to see. Means the heat is staying inside like it should and only leaving where it's meant to." He hung his coat on the peg and moved to the table where his coffee was waiting. Wyatt and Coleman had already finished their breakfast and were arguing quietly over which of them would fetch the eggs from the henhouse. Silas listened for a moment, then set his cup down. "Wyatt goes," he said. "Coleman, you stay in. I need you to help your mother." Coleman looked disappointed but did not argue. He was learning, in the way small children in that country learned early, that his father's decisions were not offered up for debate. Wyatt pulled on his heavy coat and his father's old wool scarf and stepped out through the double doors with the egg basket swinging from his hand. The morning passed in the small, quiet rituals of a homestead in winter. Eleanor kneaded bread dough at the table, her hands white with flour to the wrists. Silas mended a broken harness strap by the light of the window. Coleman played on the floor with a set of wooden animals his father had whittled for him the previous Christmas. The stove ticked and hummed. The wind, when it stirred at all, brushed softly against the outer walls and passed on. But something else was happening in that cabin, something Silas noticed by degrees as the morning wore on. The stove was burning low. He had not fed it in nearly 2 hours, and yet the room was still warm. Not merely tolerable, warm. He could feel it on the back of his neck as he worked at the harness. He looked at the small brass thermometer he had hung on the interior wall the previous week and saw that it read 62 degrees, when by all rights it should have been reading closer to 45. He set the harness aside and stood up. He walked slowly around the interior of the cabin, running his palm along the hides at different heights, feeling for the places where cold might be seeping through. He found none. Along the north wall, where the sharpest cold ought to have been penetrating, the innermost hide was actually warm to the touch, as though the layered skins behind it were holding heat like a great slow-breathing lung. Eleanor watched him from the table, her hands paused in the dough. "What is it, Silas?" He did not answer immediately. He was thinking about the old Blackfoot man beside the fire, and the way the old man had spoken of skin, remembering the animal. He had believed for years, since he had first begun planning this cabin, that the hides would work as ordinary insulation, better than logs alone, better than plaster. But now, standing in his own kitchen and feeling warmth radiating from a wall on a snow-covered morning, he understood that something more was happening. "They're holding it," he said quietly. "The walls are holding it." Eleanor did not entirely understand what he meant, and she said so. Silas came to the table and sat down across from her. He picked up a small pinch of her flour and let it fall through his fingers back onto the board. "When you bank a fire," he said, "you cover the coals with ash. The ash doesn't burn, but it holds the heat inside and the fire keeps burning slow for hours. Log walls don't do that. Log walls take the heat and send it right out through themselves and away into the cold. But hides hold it. They soak it up. And once they're warm through, they stay warm and they give the warmth back to the room slow, like coals under ash." He paused, looking down at the flour on his fingertips. "The old man told me this. I did not understand him at the time. I thought he was talking about spirits or memory, but he meant it plain. He meant that skin holds heat different than wood does, and he was right." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, in the low, careful voice a wife uses when she has been carrying a question for a while and is finally ready to ask it, "Silas, if you knew this all along, why did you not tell anyone? Why did you not tell Josiah Barnes when he came here angry, or Hattie Coyne when she came here confused? Why did you let them think you had gone mad?" Silas turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Because I did not know it would work, Eleanor. I hoped it would. I remembered it would. But there is a difference between a boy sitting in a Blackfoot lodge in shirt sleeves and a man building a house for his own family in a country that has already killed men better than him. I could not stand out there in the yard and tell Josiah Barnes that I was building my walls a certain way because an old Indian told me to when I was 7 years old. He would have thought I was worse than mad. He would have thought I was a fool. And maybe I was." He looked up at her. "I could not risk being talked out of it. Not by him, not by Hattie, not by anyone. If I was going to gamble on this, I had to gamble alone until I could see for myself whether it held. And now I can see." Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were still dusted with flour and they left small pale prints on the back of his weathered skin. "You are a strange man, Sela's thorn," she said softly, "but you are my strange man and you have kept us warm this morning." He almost smiled at that, almost. Then the wind outside gave a small shift, a change so slight that most people would not have noticed it, and Silas turned his head sharply toward the window. The sound was not a howl. It was not yet even a proper gust. It was a low breath, a kind of long exhalation that seemed to come from somewhere far to the north, rolling down across the empty prairie toward them like a wave arriving from a great distance. Silas rose from the table and crossed to the window. He pulled aside the inner hide curtain and looked out through the glass. The sky had changed again. The dark band along the northern horizon was no longer a band. It was a wall. A vast dark wall stretching from one edge of the visible world to the other, blotting out the pale morning light behind it. And even as he watched, the leading edge of that wall began to slide across the sun. The temperature outside, which had been merely cold that morning, began to fall in a way that was almost audible. Silas could hear it in the small popping sounds the frozen ground made beyond the porch, in the way the snow itself seemed to grow harder and drier and more brittle as the seconds passed. He turned from the window. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was very steady, which was how she knew that whatever was coming was worse than either of them had prepared for. "Get the boys up in the loft. Wrap them in the buffalo robe. Put the second robe over them. Do it now." Eleanor did not ask why. She did not have to. She rose from the table with more speed than a woman 7 months along ought to have been able to manage, and she called Coleman to her. Wyatt came in through the outer door with a basket of frozen eggs a few minutes later, and Silas caught him by the shoulder before he had even finished stamping the snow from his boots. He turned the boy around gently, opened the outer door again, and pointed north. Wyatt stared, his mouth opened. He was too young to have seen a storm like the one bearing down on them, but he was old enough to understand what he was seeing. The wall of dark cloud had grown so tall that it now covered nearly half the visible sky, and the leading edge of it was rolling and boiling in a way that seemed almost alive. Beneath it, the prairie had gone the color of old lead. The wind, which had been merely quiet a few minutes earlier, was now beginning to rise in a low, steady tone that was not yet violent but that carried a promise of violence in it. "Go up to the loft with your brother," Silas said quietly. "Help your mother settle in. I'll be up directly." Wyatt nodded once and climbed the ladder without another word. Silas closed the outer door, then closed the inner door, then walked once around the perimeter of the cabin, checking every layer, every seam, every point where a draft might find its way through. He tightened the tacks along the north wall where he had felt the smallest cold current earlier that morning. He pulled the hide curtains fully across the window and tied them off. He banked the stove not with wood but with a careful arrangement of coals and ash designed to burn slow and steady for as long as possible without needing to be tended. Then he climbed the ladder to the loft, where Eleanor had wrapped the boys in the heavy buffalo robe and drawn a second one over them like a blanket. She was sitting between them with her back against the sloped inner wall of the roof, one arm around each son. Silas sat down across from her, and for a moment none of them spoke. They only listened. The storm arrived in stages, the way great storms do. First came the deepening of the wind, from a low, steady tone into a rising moan that seemed to come from every direction at once. Then came the sudden drop in the light, as though someone had drawn a heavy curtain across the sun. Then came the snow, not falling but flying, driven horizontal across the yard so hard that the flakes struck the walls with a dry rattling sound like handfuls of sand thrown against wood. And then came the cold. The cold arrived last, and it arrived with a suddenness that took Silas's breath even inside his own layered cabin. He felt it in the small hairs along the backs of his hands. He felt it in a subtle change in the way the air moved around him, as though the very atmosphere had become heavier and denser and slower. He looked at the brass thermometer he had hung near the loft ladder. It had read 62 that morning. It now read 58, and it was falling. Outside, the temperature was doing something that neither Silas nor anyone else in that country had ever measured. Later, at the small weather station kept by the Army at Fort Keogh, it would be recorded that the air temperature dropped from 12 degrees above zero to 38 degrees below zero in the space of a single afternoon. 50 degrees of cold, arriving in less than 6 hours. It was a change so violent that cattle standing in open pasture across 3 counties would simply stop where they stood, their lungs unable to draw the freezing air fast enough to keep them alive, and remain there frozen upright until the spring thaw finally released them into the mud. Inside the thorn cabin, the thermometer near the loft ladder settled at 54 degrees and stopped falling. Silas watched it for a long time before he spoke. Eleanor had closed her eyes and was resting her head against the wall behind her, one hand on Coleman's hair and the other on Wyatt's shoulder. The boys had fallen into that shallow, uneasy half-sleep that children fall into when they are frightened but too tired to stay awake. "It's holding," Silas said quietly. Eleanor opened her eyes. She looked at the thermometer, then at her husband. "How cold is it outside, Silas?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't want to guess." The storm did not end that night, nor the next day, nor the day after that. It did not end for what would later be recorded as 116 straight hours, nearly 5 full days during which the wind never dropped below a hard, steady roar, and the temperature outside the thorn cabin never rose above 30 degrees below zero. It was the leading edge of what history books, written long after every soul who lived through it had passed on, would come to call the great die-up of 1886 to 1887, the winter that broke the open-range cattle industry across the northern plains and killed more livestock, more men, and more small settlements than any single season of weather in the recorded history of the American frontier. Inside the cabin, time began to lose its ordinary shape. Silas fed the stove sparingly, drawing on the split pine stacked in the breath room, and the small brass thermometer near the loft ladder held steady between 50 and 55 degrees throughout the whole of it. He rationed the wood carefully, but he did not need to ration it as strictly as he had feared. The hides were doing the work he had trusted them to do. The warmth from the small stove was being held inside the layered walls, the way water is held inside a covered pot, and each fresh log added heat to a room that was already retaining most of what it had. Eleanor spent much of those 5 days in the loft with the boys, wrapped in the heavy buffalo robes, telling them the old stories her own mother had told her in Ohio when she was small. She told them about the fox and the crow. She told them about the miller's daughter who spun straw into gold. She told them about the boy who cried wolf and the shepherd who did not believe him. Coleman fell asleep in the middle of most of them. Wyatt listened all the way through, his eyes serious, his small hand resting inside his mother's. Silas moved between the loft and the main room in a careful rhythm, tending the stove, checking the walls, listening at the doors, watching the small icicles that had begun to form along the outermost seam of the outer door despite the breath room between them. Twice each day he opened the inner door of the breath room, stepped inside, and inspected the outer door for any place where the cold had begun to work its way through. He never opened that outer door, not once. To open it, he knew, would be to invite the storm inside, and the storm, once inside, would not easily be persuaded to leave. On the 3rd day, Eleanor began to feel the first small tightening pains that came and went across her belly. She did not tell Silas at first. She did not want to worry him with something that might yet turn out to be nothing. But by the evening of the 4th day, the pains had grown regular enough and sharp enough that she could no longer hide them. She caught his sleeve as he passed the loft ladder on his way to feed the stove. "Silas," she said quietly, "it's early, but I think it's coming." He froze on the ladder. He looked at her face and he saw the calm resolve there that Eleanor always wore in moments when other women might have panicked, and he understood at once that she was not mistaken. He climbed the rest of the way up and sat beside her. "How close?" "Not yet, but by morning, I think." He nodded slowly. He looked at the 2 sleeping boys, at the layered hide walls surrounding them, at the small brass thermometer that still read 52 degrees, despite the fact that the storm outside had grown, if anything, more violent through the day. Hattie Coyne was 3 miles away across country that no living thing could presently cross. There would be no doctor. There would only be him and Alina and whatever knowledge the two of them possessed between them. "Then we'll do it here," he said. "You and me, we've done it twice before." Alina smiled faintly. "Not in a blizzard, we haven't. No, not in a blizzard." He climbed back down and began quietly preparing what would be needed: clean cloths, a basin of water warmed slowly on the stove, a sharp knife boiled and set aside on a clean plate. The small store of medicines Hattie had left with them on her last visit in case of just such an emergency. He worked without haste, because haste was the enemy in such moments, and because Alina, who was watching him from the loft, needed to see that he was not afraid. The child came just before dawn on the 5th day of the storm. She was a girl, small and pink and loud in a way that surprised all three of the people already living in the cabin, and she arrived in a room that held steady at 53 degrees, while the world outside the layered walls remained locked in a cold that was killing everything unprotected beneath the sky. Silas caught her in a clean linen cloth. Alina, exhausted and radiant in the way only a woman who has just done the impossible can look, took her daughter to her breast without a word. The boys had been sent down from the loft during the last hour of the labor, and they sat now at the plank table in the main room, staring up at the ladder with wide, solemn eyes. When Silas came down and told them they had a sister, Coleman burst into tears for reasons he could not have explained, and Wyatt only nodded once, gravely, as though he had known all along that this was how it would go. They named her Marion, after Alina's grandmother. She slept through her first full day of life pressed against her mother's chest beneath the buffalo robe, and the storm went on beyond the walls, and the small brass thermometer near the loft ladder held steady, and the stove burned low and slow and even. The blizzard broke on the morning of the 6th day. It did not break in the ordinary way, with the wind gradually softening and the snow gradually thinning until at last a pale sun appeared. It broke suddenly, all at once, as though some great invisible hand had reached down and stopped the whole machinery of it in a single motion. Silas, sitting by the stove with a cup of coffee grown cold in his hand, looked up sharply when the silence arrived. He had been listening to the roar of the wind for so many days that he had forgotten what its absence sounded like. The absence was almost louder than the wind had been. He rose slowly. He walked to the outer door, opened the inner one, stepped into the breath room and closed the inner door behind him. Then he unbarred the outer door and pushed it open. The world outside had been remade. The yard was gone. The freight road was gone. The fence line that had marked the eastern edge of the property was gone. Everything Silas had known, every landmark he had used to orient himself in this small corner of the world, had been buried beneath a smooth white sea of drifted snow that in places rose higher than his shoulders. The cabin itself sat at the bottom of a shallow bowl the wind had carved, but beyond that bowl the snow stretched away flat and blinding to a horizon that seemed to have moved much closer than it had been a week before. The air was cold in a way that made his lungs ache when he drew a breath, but the sky was clear. A pale, hard sun stood low above the eastern ridges, and the light coming off the snow was so bright that he had to squint against it. He stood on the porch for a long time simply looking. Somewhere to the east, faintly, he heard a sound he could not immediately identify. It was a slow, dragging sound, a scraping. He shaded his eyes and looked toward the freight road. A figure was coming. On foot, working his way along the buried trail with a long-handled shovel, throwing snow to either side as he moved. Silas did not recognize the man at first, muffled as he was in layers of wool and hide against the cold. But as the figure drew closer, he saw the gray beard beneath the frost-crusted scarf, and he saw the tall, stooped shoulders, and he understood that it was Josiah Barnes. The old rancher reached the edge of the thorn yard and stopped. He leaned on his shovel and stared at the cabin. The chimney was drawing clean white smoke straight up into the still air. The small square window glowed faintly with the warm light of the interior. Everything about the place had the calm, ordinary look of a homestead that had passed a difficult night, and was now getting on with breakfast. Josiah stood there for a long moment without moving. Then he began working his way slowly across the drift toward the porch. Silas met him at the bottom of the steps. Neither man spoke. Josiah looked at Silas's face, then at the cabin behind him, then back at Silas. His eyes were wet, though whether from the cold or from something else, Silas could not tell. "How many?" Josiah asked at last. His voice was hoarse. "4 of us in there," Silas said. "5 now. Eleanor had the baby yesterday, a girl." Josiah closed his eyes. He stood there with his eyes closed for a long time. When Josiah opened his eyes again, he did not speak for a while. He simply looked at Silas the way a man looks at another man when he has been carrying something heavy for a great many miles and has just now been permitted to set it down. "I lost 11 head of cattle in the first night," Josiah said finally. His voice was slow and worn. 23 more by the third morning. By yesterday I stopped counting. My son-in-law's place, 4 miles south of me. His hired man walked out to the barn on the second day and did not come back. They found him this morning halfway between the house and the well. Halfway, Silas. He walked 20 feet from his own door and the cold took him. Silas did not answer. There was nothing to say to news like that. "Hattie Coyne is alive," Josiah went on. "She rode over to my place 2 days ago through a break in the wind, and she has been with us since. She wanted me to come check on you. She said if you were not alive she wanted to know it, and if you were alive she wanted to know how." He shook his head slowly. "I told her I did not think there would be anything left of this place worth checking on." He looked past Silas at the cabin again, at the smoke rising straight from the chimney, at the layered hides visible through the open doorway, at the small still figure of Coleman peering around the doorframe with a piece of bread in his hand. "I owe you an apology, Silas Thorne," Josiah said. "I stood in your yard and I called you a fool. I did not use the word to your face, but I used it in my own head, and I used it in front of my wife at supper, and I used it more than once at the store in Miles City. I was wrong. I was as wrong as a man can be about another man's judgment, and I have come here this morning to say so." Silas shook his head. "You were not wrong to worry, Josiah. You were worried on my family's behalf. There is no shame in that." "There is shame in mockery," the old rancher said quietly. "And I was closer to mockery than I like to admit. Whatever you did inside those walls, I want to know it. I want every man in this valley to know it. Because next winter, or the winter after, or the winter after that, this country is going to try to kill us again. And I would rather my grandchildren learn from Silas Thorne than bury alongside him." Silas invited him inside. Josiah stamped his boots carefully in the breath room, closed the outer door behind him, and stepped through the inner one into the warm, layered heart of the cabin. He stood in the doorway looking around him for a long moment, and then he removed his hat, which was a thing men of his generation did only in the presence of the dead, or in church, or in the presence of something they did not yet understand but knew to respect. Eleanor was sitting up by the stove with Marion in her arms. She smiled at Josiah tiredly, and Josiah nodded to her with a gravity that came very close to reverence. The story of that winter spread across the northern plains slowly, in the way such stories always spread in a country where distances were vast and news traveled by wagon and by mouth. By the spring of 1887, when the melt finally came and the true scale of the disaster was measured, ranchers from Wyoming to the Dakotas were speaking of the small homestead along the Powder River where a family of 5, one of them a newborn child, had come through the coldest recorded winter in the history of the American West without a single frostbite among them. Some men came to see the cabin for themselves. Silas showed them the walls. He showed them the double door. He showed them the ceiling gap and the layered seams and the small brass thermometer that had held at 50 degrees, while the world outside was 50 degrees below zero. Marion Thorne grew up inside those hide walls, and she lived to be 91 years old, and she died in 1977 in a small nursing home in Billings, Montana. She was the last living witness to the winter her father had prepared for by listening, many years earlier, to an old Blackfoot man beside a fire. Do you think Silas Thorne was a genius, or was he simply a man humble enough to learn from those his neighbors refused to hear?